As James Cook's third voyage of exploration to the Pacific Ocean neared its conclusion and HMS Discovery entered the Thames, a young midshipman, George Gilbert, made a note in his journal. Thus ended a long, tedious and disagreeable voyage of 4 years and 3 months. Now, this lecture is only going to be about 30 minutes long or so, and I hope it won't be as tedious or disagreeable, but I'll leave that up to you to decide. What I want to talk about in this lecture are these squiggly lines. These lines represent the voyages of exploration to the Pacific Ocean undertaken by James Cook and his men between 1768 and 1780, and I'll come to each of them in turn. For starters, though, I think we need to ask the question, why should we be interested in the voyages of James Cook? Well, the simple answer is they had a huge impact. Let me give you one very brief example. The first edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica was published in 1768. That's the year that Cook embarked on his first voyage to the Pacific. And the encyclopedia included just 7 lines of description about the Pacific Ocean. By the time the third edition of the encyclopedia was published in 1788, the entry on the Pacific Ocean ran to 40 double-columned pages. And this expansion of knowledge about the ocean, its islands and its peoples mirrors almost exactly Cook's travels there in the late 1760s and 1770s. More specifically, however, Cook's voyages should encourage us to think about 3 big themes. First of all, these voyages increased the scope of human knowledge in specific and in general ways. I'm showing you a portrait of James Cook by the artist Nathaniel Dance, and the artist presents Cook as a kind of classic Enlightenment man. He is the embodiment of the Enlightenment and its ideas. He points to a map of Australia. It's a geographical fact. He's witnessed it with his own eyes. It's no longer a place for dragons and sea monsters. The second big theme for us to think about is the fact that these voyages initiated new relationships between British people and other people and culture around the world, specifically in the Pacific Ocean. I'm showing you here a drawing, an image made by the Polynesian priest and navigator Tupaia, whom Cook and his men met on their first voyage to the Pacific. And this image also depicts these encounters and relationships that were initiated by Cook's voyages. I'm showing you an image of a meeting that took place on one of the New Hebrides Islands, as depicted by William Hodges, a traveller and artist who accompanied Cook on his second voyage to the Pacific Ocean. And third and finally, I think that the final big theme for us to think about is the fact that these voyages took place at a time when Britain is finding a new place and a new role for itself in the world. So Cook departs in 1768, a few years after Britain had emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War as a genuine global superpower. And one of the questions occupying politicians at the time was, well, how does one employ the manpower and assert one's newfound global status? And there's a parallel here with what happened in the United States after the Second World War. At that time, the US diverted lots of its military research and manpower into NASA, into space exploration. And you might think or consider the Royal Navy of the 1770s as acting partially, at least, like NASA in the 1960s and 1970s. Cook opened up the Pacific for future exploration. He laid the path for things like the breadfruit expedition of William Bligh. You might have heard of the mutiny on the Bounty. Well, that mutiny took place because William Bligh, the captain, was on a journey, on a voyage to the Pacific to transport the fruit that you can see here, the breadfruit, from the Pacific to the Caribbean. Here's an idea of moving plants, transporting plants from one part of the world to another, thinking globally about the world and its resources. So why did these voyages take place in the first place? Why did Cook and his men travel to the Pacific? Well, each of the 3 voyages had a specific scientific question to answer. And the first voyage answers some of the questions that are laid out in this letter. It's a letter written by the Royal Society, the oldest scientific society in the world, writing to the King, George III, requesting assistance to solve a pressing scientific problem. the observation of the transit of Venus. Now, what is the transit of Venus? That sounds like the title of a bizarre science fiction film, but it is and was a real-life scientific problem or challenge, and something that the Enlightenment gentlemen of science were keen to solve, to sort out. But briefly, by measuring the transit of the planet Venus across the disk of the Sun, one can work out the distance of the Earth from the Sun. Now, there's lots of complex mathematics and geometry involved, which I won't go into here. It uses trigonometry and so on and so forth. The key point to remember is that ultimately it would help men of science, philosophers, to work out the size of the solar system. It would give them more knowledge and increase the store of human knowledge, and potentially be very useful in the future. Now, in order to get these measurements accurately, the transit of the planet of Venus needed to be observed from different parts and different locations around the world. And in the 1760s, the best place to see that transit of Venus was in the South Pacific. Now, the whole transit of Venus across the disk of the Sun took only 8 minutes, so you needed to be very accurate and very correct when taking the measurements. And it was only visible at certain times and in certain years. So there was a transit of Venus in 1761, and that opportunity had been missed by the Royal Society. And this is the reason they're writing this letter, to ensure that the transit of Venus due to take place in 1769 wasn't missed. Now, the best way to advance scientific inquiry in 18th century Britain, particularly when one needed to get to the South Pacific to observe the transit of Venus, was to use the Royal Navy, a little bit like NASA was used by the Americans in the 1960s. Here was a crack military arm, key to the country's defence. Remember, the nickname of the Royal Navy is the Wooden Walls that defended Britain. The Royal Navy was also a mobile and global force. Its ships could go anywhere, obviously. Now, the Admiralty, the government body that controlled and ran and organised the Navy, its priority was security and defence. It was not their job, and they weren't particularly interested in advancing science. So they weren't going to send a top-of-the-range man of war, a warship bristling with guns and cannon. Instead, because the king and his government were keen to get involved in this scientific experiment, this scientific observation, the Admiralty grudgingly agreed to go along with the plan. And in order to do so, they purchased a former coastal trading vessel, this vessel that you can see here, called the Earl of Pembroke. And it had started life as a bark, a name for a type of ship, that had transported coal from Newcastle to London. And really interestingly, it was this type of vessel, this coal bark, coastal trading vessel, that James Cook, whom we'll meet in a few minutes, started his maritime career. So James Cook is chosen eventually to command this vessel on its voyage to the South Pacific. And what's Cook's background? Can I show you a picture of him as he's kind of learning his trade in the coastal coal trading ships of the 18th century? Well, I can't show you a picture, and that's partially telling you its own story. He learned his trade with the Quaker traders of Whitby in Yorkshire. He joined the Royal Navy during the 7 Years' War, and he did some sterling and important work as a hydrographer, a map maker, especially around the mouth of the St. Lawrence River in today's Canada. And I'm showing you here a plan of the harbour of Halifax in Nova Scotia made by James Cook. But I can't show you a picture, a portrait, because Cook hadn't risen to that status yet. He was a relatively ordinary sailor when he started his career, and even in the Navy, he was a good officer and a really good hydrographer and map maker, but he hadn't risen through the ranks yet. So he was a really good compromise candidate as someone who was both part of the Navy and a naval officer, but also someone with an interest in and an aptitude for taking scientific observations and making calculations. Let's get back to the ship, the vessel, the Earl of Pembroke that we met a few moments ago. When the Admiralty bought it, grudgingly, for about £3,000 at the time, they decided to rename it and called it Endeavour to kind of capture the spirit of the enterprise that they were about to undertake. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of its design here, but I just want briefly to make the point that it was sturdy, it was well built, it was quite broad and flat at the bottom. In other words, good for carrying lots of stores, supplies for the sailors, but also useful for sailing in very shallow waters. As I say, it cost nearly £3,000 to buy it, but the Admiralty government spent another £2,500 on refitting it, on renovating it, on making it worthy, seaworthy for a long, arduous trip to the Pacific. They built new cabins for various members of the crew that would be accompanying Cook on his way. And they turned the great cabin at the rear, the stern of the ship, into a kind of laboratory, a place where men of science, where these kind of officers and philosophers who had been thinking about this transit of Venus, taking measurements, doing other sorts of scientific experiments, where they could work and converse and do their research. Now, they took a variety of scientific instruments with them, state-of-the-art instruments like this object. It's a quadrant made by a very eminent scientific instrument maker at the time, a man called John Bird. And one of the interesting things about this instrument is that it was stolen by the Tahitians that Cook would meet on his voyage, subsequently recovered, of course, but in a classic case of cultural misunderstanding and kind of intercultural negotiation, this quadrant became a kind of object of negotiation between the British sailors and the Tahitian locals on the island. Now, it wasn't just scientific instruments, of course, that the crew had to take with them. They also had to take lots of stores and supplies for the voyage. I'm showing you here a ship's biscuit, the kind of biscuit that would have been eaten by sailors on board. These are not your kind of sweet biscuits that you have with your afternoon tea. These are much harder and much less appetizing and much less tasty. There are all sorts of other stores and supplies that they would have taken with them. A list survives, and we can tell that they took 6,000 pieces of pork, 4,000 pieces of beef, 9 tons of flour, 5 tons of bread, 3 tons of sauerkraut to give them that kind of vitamin C and make sure they don't suffer from scurvy, 250 barrels of beer, 44 barrels of brandy, 17 barrels of rum, and so on and so forth. So they really had to make sure that they had enough food, enough supplies to last them for several months, because it was unsure. They were unclear when they would next get a chance to top up these supplies by calling at a port or a harbour. Now, I'm showing you here a map which charts the first voyage of Cook to the Pacific, that one that we've just spoken about in Endeavour, with all of those stores and supplies. Cook and his men depart from Plymouth in August 1768. You can see that they sail south through the Atlantic and arrive in Tahiti in April 1769. They stay there long enough, several months, in fact, until July, as they try and observe the transit of Venus, which was the main purpose for their voyage. Then they depart and move on to New Zealand, where they arrive in September 1769, then to Botany Bay and the east coast of Australia. And then eventually they managed to make their way back to Britain via Indonesia, across the Indian Ocean, around the southern tip of Africa, and they arrived back off Dover in July 1771. So the question is, how successful was this voyage? Well, they reached Tahiti and they set up an observation station. They did everything they could possibly do to observe the transit of Venus, to find out this information, to enable these scientists and philosophers to do their calculations. But unfortunately, the attempt was ultimately unsuccessful, because remember, the transit of Venus was a very, very quick event, 8 minutes. And if your instruments weren't absolutely perfect, absolutely accurate, you failed to get that information. And so, unfortunately, Cook and his men went all that way, 3 years away from home, and their data, their information that they collected, wasn't sufficiently accurate enough to enable people to work out the distance between the sun and the Earth. However, there were other results of this expedition. there were other positive additions to the sum and the store of human knowledge. For starters, Cook and his men managed to map New Zealand. Remember, they called there after they'd left Tahiti. They mapped New Zealand, they sailed around New Zealand, and they proved that New Zealand was actually comprised of 2 islands rather than 1. And the map that you can see here, created as a result of this first expedition of Captain Cook, is very, very similar to the maps of New Zealand that we know today. So adding to the store of human geographical knowledge. Cook and his men also met people and encountered new cultures, new societies. And as an example of this, I'm showing you a picture, an image made by one of the artists who accompanied Cook on his first voyage, Sidney Parkinson. And he is here depicting an image of a Maori gentleman with those amazing facial tattoos. And you can imagine the impact that an image like this would have had back in Britain, where people had never really seen Maori people, never encountered their culture or their society before. So Cook and his men collect knowledge, gather information about other cultures and societies. And Cook didn't just stop in New Zealand, as we know. He moved on to Australia. And again, he maps the eastern seaboard of Australia. And as you can see from this map, produced in 1753, it was very badly in need of mapping. The extent of European knowledge about that coastline of Australia, all the way from Tasmania up to the northern coast, was very sketchy. In fact, very inaccurate. As you can see here, in the middle of the 18th century, Europeans still believed that Tasmania was connected to the mainland of Australia, and they had no idea what the eastern coastline of Australia looked like. So Cook and his men helped to correct that, to document that for the first time. And they called at Botany Bay, and they encountered not just new civilizations and societies and people, they encountered new animals, new fauna that people in Europe had never seen before. The dingo, and I'm showing you here a picture of the kangaroo that Cook and his men saw in Australia. Now, you might think that when you've completed one voyage to the South Pacific, that would be enough for anyone, but not so for James Cook. In just a few years, he was off again on a second voyage to the Pacific, this time better funded, better supported by the Admiralty and by the government, and Cook had 2 ships rather than just 1. So instead of the Endeavour, this time he went with the Resolution and the Adventure. And the plan on this occasion was to circumnavigate the globe, to sail all the way around the globe, but to pay, again, particular attention to the Pacific. And the particular and specific question that was to be answered on this occasion wasn't anything to do with the transit of Venus or to do with planets in the sky. On this occasion, it was to resolve once and for all the issue of whether there was a great unknown southern continent looming somewhere in the South Pacific Ocean. People at the time called it Terra Australis Incognita. They thought that because there was so much landmass in the northern hemisphere, there must be an equal landmass in the southern hemisphere. They assumed that somewhere near the Antarctica, there would be a great big continent waiting to be discovered. And so that's what Cook's second voyage was all about. And you can see the path that he took here as he tried desperately to rattle around the South Pacific Ocean and find this unknown continent. He also carried, again, important pieces of scientific equipment with him. And this is a really vital piece of technical equipment. It looks very elegant, but it's crucial because it is the basis of every modern GPS system that we know. It's K1. It's a chronometer. It's a fancy name for a watch, made by a man called Larkham Kendall. And he based this chronometer on a prototype produced by John Harrison. And ultimately, this chronometer, this instrument, solved the problem of determining longitude. It was able to keep perfect time. And it was, according to James Cook, infinitely depended upon because of that reason. And because it could keep perfect time, it meant that you could measure your distance east or west of Greenwich, of an imaginary line drawn north-south through the world, based on Greenwich. And by allowing you to do that, it meant that your coordinates, where you stood on the globe, north, south, and east, west were easy to determine. So really crucial piece of scientific technology that was proved by Cook on this second voyage. And yet again, scientists and philosophers and Enlightenment men went with Cook on his voyage. Here I'm showing you a picture of Johann and George Foster, who were the official scientists of the expedition. And unlike the previous expedition, where a lot of botanical specimens were collected, these men were more interested in anthropology, in other words, the science of mankind, the science of humankind, understanding human societies and cultures. And so the second voyage really paid a lot of attention to the societies and cultures that Cook encountered, as well as the flora and fauna that they met on their voyage. And we met very briefly a few moments ago the official expedition artist that accompanied Cook on this second voyage, a man called William Hodges. And Hodges was detailed by the Admiralty to take views of everywhere that Cook and his men called that. So the expedition again leaves Britain and sails south through the Atlantic Ocean and calls at Cape Town at the southern tip of Africa. And you can see here a picture painted by William Hodges to commemorate that event, to send back to Britain as a kind of giant postcard reminding people in Britain where Cook had got to by this early stage in his voyage. The crew then and the ships then move on looking for this great southern continent that they expect to be there. And they sail so far south that they become the first Europeans to see southern icebergs, southern hemisphere icebergs. And this is a very grainy image, a print based on one of Hodges' paintings showing an iceberg from the southern hemisphere. Ultimately, though, in August 1773, Cook and his men arrive in warmer climates. They return to Tahiti. They visit Tahiti again, and William Hodges, a very capable and talented artist, is able to represent these images and capture the beauty and the light and the colour of these islands. He kind of collects these views. He gathers this information and describes it and depicts it in paint. And all of these visual impressions relate to the issues of trying to understand how these cultures and societies operate, trying to make sense of the ways of life and the belief systems of other cultures and civilizations and societies. Here is an enormous painting made by William Hodges showing the warboats of Tahiti. He's trying to understand the maritime culture of this society in Tahiti, just as he is part of the maritime culture of 18th century Britain. And this is perhaps one of Hodges' most famous images from that second voyage to the Pacific, an image depicting the amazing statues on Easter Island in the very east of the Pacific Ocean. Again, another place called that on the second voyage, and another island, another culture, another society that is encountered by Cook and his men as they try to solve this scientific question. So what are the results of this second voyage of Cook to the Pacific? Well, for starters, he disproves the existence for once and for all of a great southern continent, unknown, lurking somewhere in the South Pacific. Australia, what we call today Australia, what they would have known at the time as New Holland, was known to Cook and his men, and you can see that they have mapped that even further. But there isn't another great big continent in the South Pacific, at least. On a personal level, Cook was promoted to captain. So he had departed and embarked on his first voyage as an ordinary lieutenant. He was a lieutenant when he left on his second voyage, but by virtue of his scientific endeavours, the quality of his leadership, he is promoted to captain. And he is given the role of Master of Greenwich Hospital. And he could have retired and spent a long and peaceful retirement in charge of Greenwich Hospital. He's also recognised by the scientific community. He is elected a Fellow of the Royal Society, a great honour for a naval man. And I'm showing you here an image of the Copley Medal, which the Society awarded to James Cook by virtue of the fact that he had managed to keep all of his men, all of his crew healthy and alive. He hadn't lost a single man to scurvy or to disease, which was an amazing feat in the 18th century and explained perhaps by all of those tons of fresh beef and pork and sauerkraut that he brought with him to complement the dry biscuit that he also had as part of his supplies. So he is awarded the medal. He doesn't actually ever pick up the medal. It's given to his wife after he had departed on his third voyage to the Pacific. But he does have time between his second and third voyage to have his portrait painted by this artist, Nathaniel Dance. And again, Cook has risen from being an ordinary sailor, a man who works on those coal barks, transporting coal from Newcastle to London, joins the Navy and rises through its ranks to reach the status of a man who has his portrait painted by one of the great society artists of the day. And he is described, this is James Cook, is described in the House of Lords as the first navigator in Europe. So he's really reached the height of his profession. And as I say, he could have retired and had a very lucrative and successful retirement in Greenwich. But the draw of the Pacific, the lure of scientific discovery and exploration drew him back to the Pacific. And just a year after he returns from his second voyage, he is again on the way to the Pacific on his third and final voyage. Now this time, the third voyage, it departs with two ships again. And you can see the outbound arrow is in red. And you can see that in this voyage, on this occasion, they're not looking at the South Pacific, they're actually looking towards the Northern Pacific Ocean. And the specific scientific question at hand on this occasion is to find this fabled Northwest Passage. For centuries, men had been looking for a passage between across the north of the continent of America through a so-called Northwest Passage to get to Asia, to get to the markets and the riches of China and Japan, much easier than having to go all the way around Africa and across the Indian Ocean. So the task at hand is to try and find a shortcut to Asia if you want. And that's what Cook and his men are tasked with doing. They leave Plymouth in 1776. You can see that they pass by Cape Town in southern Africa. They call at New Zealand again. They sail north, calling at Tahiti again. In 1778, they become the first Europeans to visit Hawaii, which they call the Sandwich Islands. But Hawaii is a group of islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, missed by all of the previous explorers and voyagers to the Pacific. But Cook and his men call there. And they spend some time there before they then go off up the coast of the northwest coast of North America, mapping it, charting it, laying down scientific knowledge that's still being used today as they go looking for this Northwest Passage. They sail around Alaska. They spend some time in the Bering Strait, which separates North America from Asia. And they sail then back down to Hawaii to spend the winter there. Obviously, it's cold and frozen up north, so they decide to spend the winter there. And that's really where disaster strikes for Cook on a personal level. Because on the 14th of February, 1779, James Cook is killed. He dies on a beach in Hawaii following an altercation with the local Hawaiians. And there's a whole series of stories and myths and histories that have grown up around the circumstances of Cook's death. Some people say that he was trying to protect the local Hawaiians from his sailors. Other people say that he was sacrificed by the Hawaiians because they believed him to be the reincarnation of one of their gods. And there's lots of continuing discussion and debate about what actually happened. But what we know for certain is that Cook dies in Hawaii. He never makes it back from his third voyage to the Pacific. His two ships eventually make it back to Britain. News of his death has already reached Britain across the overland route from Russia to Europe. And people in Britain are taken aback by the death of this first navigator, this great explorer. The man who had built his reputation over the previous decade is now no more. Tears are shed in the House of Commons. Laments are written. Poems are published. And paintings are are depicted. This is an image showing the imaginary death of Cook, painted by a man called Johann Zoffany, another very famous artist, trying to depict what he thinks might have happened on the beach in Hawaii. It's almost certain that it didn't happen like this, but Johann Zoffany is trying to imagine the death of a hero, the death of Cook, a man who dies not for his country on this occasion, but for science, a man who dies trying to discover and explore the Pacific Ocean. Now, Cook's death brought him yet more fame. He's represented here by Zoffany as like a classical hero. And you might think that that would be kind of the end of the story, but far from it, because in many ways, Cook's afterlife, his life after death, is just as busy as his life exploring the Pacific, because he becomes this kind of hero of exploration, a scientific hero that is still with us today. So very briefly, let me show you in the 19th century how he becomes domesticated. Cook is now somebody to be represented in household pottery. Anyone can have a little statue of Cook, this scientific icon that they can place on their mantelpiece. This image, a piece of pottery based, of course, on that Nathaniel Dance image that I showed you at the very beginning of the lecture. Cook is a household name and a household piece of pottery. And even into the 20th century, Cook's fame and his exploits and his explorations are being used for other reasons. I'm showing you here a lithograph, an image, a print made by the Australian National Travel Association in the 1930s, depicting one of the kind of iconic moments where Cook lands at Botany Bay in 1770. And this is kind of used as a well-known incident, a well-known historical events to try and link Australia with Britain. And this is perhaps my favourite image, showing the way that Cook was and Cook's reputation was used and employed after his death right into the 20th century. Here is a poster from the 1950s advertising Qantas, Australia's national airline. And in many ways, it's quite ironic, because Qantas, an airline which has kind of supplanted the need for taking ships over long distances and spending months and months at sea. Instead, you can get on a plane and be in Australia in a matter of hours. They are still using Cook and his reputation as an explorer, as a man who connects Britain and Australia, Britain and the Pacific. So let me leave you by bringing us back to James Cook, the man. And this is a portrait painted by William Hodges, that official artist on the second voyage, which I think in many ways captures something about James Cook and the inner life of Cook, the explorer. Here's a man that had shared a ship with William Hodges for several years. They'd been to the South Pacific and back again. They'd seen lots and lots of things together. And Hodges, the artist, is trying to capture something of Cook, the man, and the explorer. And I think you can see in those eyes and the kind of determination on his face something of the kind of steel and determination that Cook needed to embark on these 3 voyages to the Pacific, to stay so many years away from home, to explore so many places, to try and uncover so many scientific secrets. So as I say, I hope that's given you a very brief sense of James Cook, his voyages to the Pacific, and why they should matter to us today. Thank you very much.